Well, I want to welcome you to the next study of the Mind of Christ. I'm on section 48, which is according to A.T. Robertson's Harmony of the Gospels. And I'll be reading the text here in just a moment. I want to, before I begin, this is a little shorter passage or section. But before I begin, I want to begin to shift a little bit of emphasis on the Mind of Christ study. We're not going to stop the study, at least for not right now. Um, there's so much material in this study, um, and I will be focusing on the uh, chronology of the life of Christ as well as the journals that I've written over a 7 year period. We're in journal number 3 right now, and there's 21 journals, so you can see that we'll never run out of material. But I want to shift the emphasis just a little bit here, and it has to do with kind of where we are in the life of our church. Central. And, even if you're not part of Central, you'll be able, I think, to gain a lot of good things from this study. Uh, but where we are in the life of our church is this reemergence after the pandemic. We had our first service this past Sunday. We had about 23, I think, there was there that for the first time, which I thought was great, was excellent. It was wonderful to have people in the room, and it felt like we're getting back to normal. And then as time goes on, it will all be coming back, hopefully sooner than later. But as we reemerge, and as Central and every church in this land begins to get going again, uh, there's really some intentionality involved in what we want to look like, what do we want to be qualitatively different in our coming back. And one of the things that I talked about in the message on Sunday was this fulfilling Jesus's teaching that the greatest commandments, of course, is to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. It's essential that we fulfill that twofold mandate. Um, the vertical dimension of our relationship, loving God, and the horizontal relationship of loving one another. It's essential that we do that. I mean, if we don't do that, we don't know anything about the mind of Christ. We're just fooling ourselves because that is central to the mind of Christ. Um, as we go through the different phases of the life of Christ, the teachings of Christ, we need to see this as um, how would I say? We need to see this as part of the discipling process. Jesus came to make disciples. He called people to be disciples. He spent his whole ministry of 3 years making disciples and training them so that they could go and make other disciples. And so, if we're not part of that kind of culture and that kind of life, then again, we're missing the intent of the mind of Christ. We might, in studying the mind of Christ, be much more knowledgeable and have a lot of insights and so forth, but it's about putting it into practice. It's about fitting it into a discipleship model and seeing how these things look in the life of a disciple. So we'll look at it in the life of Jesus, and then the transference needs to be into our own lives and living that out. So I want you to keep that in mind as the backdrop for what we're going to be doing, and I'm going to try to emphasize that a little bit more in the days ahead as we continue the study of the mind of Christ. Okay, so section 48, Matthew chapter 9. Starting in verse 14, I'm going to read all three of the texts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. This is not found in John. And after we get all three of the texts, we will jump into the study. Matthew chapter 9, verse 14. And then the disciples of John came to him, saying, Why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? And Jesus said to them, The attendants of the bridegroom cannot mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them, can they? But the days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. But no one puts a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch pulls away from the garment, and a worse tear results. Nor do men put new wine into old wineskins, otherwise the wineskins burst, and the wine pours out, and the wineskins are ruined. But they put new wine into fresh wineskins, and both are preserved. All right, then we'll go over to Mark chapter 2. Mark chapter 2, and we'll start in verse 18. And again, these are very similar, but there are some minor differences in the way it is phrased. It says, "And John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and they came and they said to him, 'Why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?' And Jesus said to them, 'While the bridegroom is with them, the attendants of the bridegroom do not fast, do they? So long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. But the days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in that day. No one who sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, otherwise the patch will pull away from it, and the new from the old, and a worse tear results. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins, otherwise the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is lost, and the skins as well. But one puts new wine into fresh wineskins." And then the last one is found over in Luke, the 5th chapter, Luke chapter 5, and we'll begin in verse 33, Luke 5:33. "And then they said to him, the disciples of John often fast and offer prayers. The disciples of the Pharisees also do the same. But yours eat and drink." And Jesus said to them, "You cannot make the attendants of the bridegroom fast while the bridegroom is with them, can you? But the days will come, and when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and they will fast in those days." And he also was telling them a parable. "No one tears a piece from a new garment and puts it on an old garment. Otherwise, he will both tear the new, and the piece from the new will not match the old. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins, otherwise the new wine will burst the skins, and it will be spilled out, and the skins will be ruined. But new wine must be put into fresh wineskins. And no one, after drinking old wine, wishes for new, for he says the old is good enough." So here we have three accounts. It's focused on the idea of fasting. That's the question that was being asked here. Now, all of these accounts follow on the heels of the party that was held at Matthew's home, Matthew the tax collector, and I see no reason to assume that the occasion has really changed here. All the players are there, the Pharisees, the disciples, and of John, and some disciples of Jesus, and of course the tax collectors and so forth. The presence of John's disciples may be new, but it would not be unusual for them to be around. Mark seems to indicate that the Pharisees and John's disciples are together in their questioning. Matthew seems to indicate only John's disciples are questioning, but Luke indicates only the Pharisees are questioning. The way Luke puts it also says that the occasion has really not changed as well. The connection between the Pharisees and the disciples of John may be because of the perceived conservative, ascetic nature of both groups. In other words, John's disciples and the Pharisees were similar in some of their characteristics. They were both very conservative, they were separatists, and so they may have had some things in common. John came neither eating or drinking, Jesus says. And though John was rough on the Jewish leaders, calling them to repentance before their baptism, it may have seemed, at least in the area of fasting, that John's group stuck closer to the traditions of the elders and outward piety. And so you can see a similarity between John's disciples and the Pharisees. The For the Pharisees, it may have been simply been an opportunity to improve their own criticism of Jesus by aligning with John in this case. For John's disciples, it may have been honest inquiry, but for the Pharisees, it may have been just another trap. They were trying to trap Jesus in this question. In Luke 18 and verse 12, this Jew in this occasion says, "I fast twice per week." And he was very proud of the fact that he fasted twice per week. Regardless of the exact schedule or ritual of the Pharisees or John's disciples, the danger was to see it as a means to righteousness instead of a result of righteousness by faith. And that's a very important point here. The question is not whether we fast or not. The question is, why do we do it? If we do it merely as a ritual in order to gain favor with God, in order to gain by some righteous act, to gain some favor or some benefit from God, then we're doing it for the wrong reason. The relationship to God comes first, and then the fasting follows. Jesus has just spoken of the righteous not needing a physician. If the Pharisees saw this righteousness obtained by fasting or by tithing or any other means, they would continue to think that they did not need a doctor. Their focus was on the ritual. Jesus is going to turn their attention to the presence or the absence of the bridegroom, which is about relationship and not about ritual. And so when we're thinking about our growing as disciples of Christ, it's very important for us to focus on the relationship we have with Jesus and not certain rituals that we might perform in order to enhance that relationship. What is the basis of the relationship? And in this case, he's going to talk about fasting in relationship to the bridegroom, who is Jesus, of course. According to Mark, both groups, John's disciples and the Pharisees, were fasting. It seems maybe even at the time that they were questioning, they were even in that moment fasting. This may have been at a set day expected of all good Jews, especially those who followed a rabbi. Luke adds the disciples of John often fast and offer prayers. The disciples of the Pharisees do the same. But yours eat and drink, he says. And so he's saying to Jesus, your disciples eat and drink. They said, well, who is the they? Who? Mark says both the Pharisees and John's disciples. So they're kind of united on this question and seem to be somewhat critical of what Jesus is doing. Remember, Jesus has not yet taught his disciples to pray. In Luke chapter 11, Jesus' disciples said, Lord, teach us to pray, just as John also taught his disciples. He's also going to teach them about fasting in the Sermon on the Mount. But we haven't gotten to the Sermon on the Mount yet. So whether he's taught them about fasting up to this point, we don't really know. But we do know that the teaching on prayer came later, and the teaching on fasting that we have comes later than this event. So Jesus provides an explanation for why his disciples are in celebration mode and not in fasting mode. Jesus has already experienced an extreme fast of 40 days and nights prior to his ministry beginning. And he also had gone without food for some time in John chapter 4 when he met with the woman at the well. You remember the disciples went into the town, bought some food, came back to him, and he wouldn't eat because he was teaching. And he says, I have food that you don't know anything about. So there was at least a period of time during that day that he went without food. And so would it have been wrong for Jesus' disciples to fast while he was still with them? If we're talking about ritual and if we're talking about some rule, then that might be the question we would ask. Or was Jesus putting fasting in a discretionary category and indicating it should not be done as some routine or done arbitrarily, but in a context with a certain purpose? Now, there's a lot to say about fasting, and I'm not going to say it all in this message, but fasting seems always to be tied to a certain purpose. This is difficult to apply. The presence or absence of the bridegroom determines fasting according to Jesus. And I would recommend a particular book to you. It's written by John Piper called Hunger for God. And it gets into the more spiritual, in-depth reasons for fasting, not just simply how to fast, but some of the spiritual background on fasting. So the book is called Hunger for God by John Piper. In Matthew's account, Jesus says the attendants of the bridegroom cannot mourn. Doesn't say fast. It says they cannot mourn as long as the bridegroom is present, but will fast when he is taken away. So there is a correlation between mourning and fasting. Surely Jesus equates mourning and fasting, at least in this particular context. Later, he cautions about when one is fasting, disfiguring their faces so as to make everyone say, wow, look at that person. They're fasting, and praise them for fasting. Excuse me. Luke indicates that those with the bridegroom would have to be made to fast. It would be unnatural for them to do so. So we're really beginning to get at a very important point here in our relationship with Jesus as disciples, is that is the point of what is appropriate and what is not appropriate, depending on context of our lives. So the attendant here, particular word that's used in the text we just read, the attendant to the bridegroom, is used in all three of the Gospels. It is it can mean kinship, it can mean child, it can mean son. Generally, it has to do with a male offspring or son or a descendant, or figuratively as an object of parental love. It's used in several places. Even the Pharisees have the sons of the Pharisees. John the Baptist describes himself as the friend of the bridegroom, and not an attendant, but a friend. In John chapter 3, verse 29, he who has the bride is the bridegroom, but the friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him rejoices greatly because of the bridegroom's voice. And so this joy of mine has been made full. Now again, contrast that joy in the presence of the bridegroom with the mourning in the absence of the bridegroom. But here we have John's rejoicing greatly with full joy. Is a phrase that's found also in John chapter 17 about make my joy complete, the fullness of my joy. So if John is rejoicing because Jesus is still with them, then why are John's disciples fasting? And why did John come neither eating or drinking? Those are curious questions in this regard. It seems to me that Jesus was not condemning fasting while he was on earth, but rather defending his disciples' choice. In other words, they chose, at least in that occasion, while these other people were fasting, they chose not to fast. And remember, they were being called into question and wanting to know, why aren't they fasting? And Jesus is defending their choice not to fast based on them being with the bridegroom. And so he's defending his disciples' choice not to fast while enjoying his presence. For the Pharisees and John's disciples, it was becoming a formula or a ritual without meaning or thought. Jesus' disciples were happy and expressed it by eating and drinking and celebrating. They had a reason for their response. It was from the heart. It was authentic. And again, in our mission statement, we want to be authentic in our relationship with God through Jesus. And in doing so, we have to, when we do something, we don't do it just simply out of some ritual. We do it from the heart because it means something. It has some purpose. So throughout his ministry, Jesus drops hints or gives indications of what is to come. Here he speaks of the bridegroom being, quote, taken away. The analytical Greek lexicon gives no other reference to this word than in this story. It's used by all three Gospels. These are actually pretty chilling words. It's not going away, that the bridegroom is going away, but the bridegroom is going to be taken away. He's going to be arrested. He's going to be put in chains. He's going to be abducted. He's going to be detained. He's going to be escorted and removed, locked away, jailed, taken into custody, under the control of others, at least seemingly. This phrase points or paints a picture, since I know the rest of the story, that his disciples and the disciples of John could not even imagine. And the Pharisees would participate in him being taken away. John himself would be arrested soon and would be executed. Especially appropriate because of today, and this was written back on April the 5th, 2011, and on that particular day, we were praying for 5 Christians in Iran who were going to go on trial for blasphemy against Islam. And they are the taken away ones. They're going to be taken away. Since the days of Jesus, his followers have been taken away. These are terrible times. And so when the bridegroom is taken away, that's when there's going to be fasting. When he's with them, there's a celebration because he's with them. So the opposite of taken away is with them. One key to this ministry, his ministry, was to be with his disciples. Mark 3 and verse 13. The with and the taken away is in reference to his disciples and the effect that this has on them, either joy of him being with them or mourning. The extremes of these emotions depends on where Jesus is. Romans chapter 12 talks about weeping or mourning. We weep with those who weep. We mourn with those who mourn. We rejoice with those who rejoice. It depends on circumstances as to what the appropriate responses are. So how are we to understand this? Regarding fasting, is Jesus simply talking about his disciples who lived on earth with him and experienced his presence and then they lost it? Is it they who will mourn and fast and pray? But what about after the resurrection? Will their mourning be turned into joy because Jesus is alive and with them again over and of course will live even through the Holy Spirit? And is the mourning only focused on the loss of Jesus and not other kinds of losses? You see, we have to take this particular teaching on fasting within a certain context. So Jesus wept, for instance, over Lazarus. The Pharisees and John's disciples seemed to mourn and fast generically instead of it being tied to the loss of a relationship. In Luke chapter 5 and verse 35, and Luke makes Jesus' words about his disciples fasting specific to the days in which he is taken away. Then they will fast in those days, he says. We need to look at Piper on this, and in this day of fasting. In other words, there's an occasion of fasting. In discussing this later in John 16, Jesus tells his disciples, truly, truly, I say to you, that you will weep and lament, but the world will rejoice. You will be sorrowful, but your sorrow will be turned to joy. Jesus even promises that after the period of sorrow, he will see them again. and your heart will rejoice, and no one takes away your joy from you. In verse 22 of John chapter 16. I am questioning whether our fasting today should be about not having the Messiah with us, since he has not left us as orphans and promised the Holy Spirit to them when he left. In the upper room for the 10 days before Pentecost, it says they devoted themselves to prayer, but it doesn't mention fasting in that particular context. Now the disciples did fast after Pentecost, Acts chapter 13, but it was related to a specific ministry work and not to the absence of Jesus or the bridegroom. In fact, the church's head or husband is Jesus. Was generic routine fasting on certain days, again, not commanded by God, simply inconsistent with being with Jesus at a feast that he obviously sanctioned? Jesus trumps tradition. If it's okay with him, it's okay. In other words, for them to criticize the disciples of Jesus for not fasting on that particular day when they were fasting was out of line, because they were doing what was appropriate because they were with Jesus on this day of feasting. The parables that Jesus tells about the shrunken and the unshrunken cloth, and the old and the new wine in the wineskins are almost identical. Luke adds a little bit more. Relating these parables to the context is very important. Here again, old thinking in old forms versus new thinking in new forms. The practice of fasting routinely was ingrained in Jewish society, especially among the religious people. So this was an old practice. It was ingrained in their society. The old thinking was about fasting, along with other routines, in order to attain and maintain one's right relationship with God. The old thinking was legalistic in nature. In their mind, Jesus' disciples were not keeping the rules. The rules were as familiar as old wine and a worn blanket. There was security in them, even if the meaning and the purpose was long since lost over time. It's like my doing this journaling each morning. It is driven by my passion to know Jesus and the depth of his mind, or do I simply find security each morning in this activity? You see, it depends on, do I lose sight of why I'm doing this? Am I doing this in order to really attain the mind of Christ and to be transformed? Because that's what discipleship is all about, is the transformation of life, so that I think different, so that I will speak different, and so that I will act differently. Or if it's just an activity I do every morning because it gives me some security, it makes me feel closer to God, it makes me feel like, I'm somehow going to get to go to heaven because I study and write in my journal every day, then that's not what this is about. Jesus wanted the form to reflect the reality of the situation. Something new was among them, or someone new. They were not appreciating or recognizing who was among them. The rules were more important than Jesus was. He's the Son of God. The sheer excitement of having the Messiah among them should have thrown them into a celebratory mode. It is like when they saw the miracle of the healing of the paralytic, which should have produced awe and wonder and amazement, but rather it had produced criticism, jealousy, defensiveness. Jesus addresses this in Matthew chapter 11, verses 16 and following. He says, we played a flute. It should produce dancing and singing. And we also sung a dirge, and it should have produced mourning, but it didn't do either one. Jesus was looking for appropriate responses, responses that fit reality. Unshrunk cloth is going to shrink. It does what it is designed to do. And new wine will expand. It is made that way. Old cloth, old wineskins cannot stretch without breaking. They had lost their capacity to include anything else in their hearts, especially the Son of God. The Creator of the universe, the great I am, the Alpha and the Omega. Jesus is the new wine, not some new rule he taught or some new practice. Step into the flow of a relationship with him as normal as a husband and a wife. The emphasis on these parables has traditionally been on change, and indirectly it is probably true. It is about change. But it seems to me that it's not new ideas or new teachings that is in competition with old ideas and old teaching, like Old and New Testament. But rather, Jesus seems to put the emphasis on how is it appropriate to be in his presence or company while he is with us. If Jesus is with us, what is the appropriate response to him being here? Note, as long as the bridegroom is with them, could this be a great controlling truth of life? How do we act, live, and think, and respond, and be when Jesus is with us? Appropriate behavior or thinking is tied to the current reality of our perception of this reality. Jesus' critics did not fully realize who he was, or just didn't want to admit it, because Jesus did not fit in their world, a world or life they constructed out of many different materials, traditions, cultural influences, personality, and the like. Now, Jesus is sown into their old cloth and poured into their old wineskin. The outcome is there will be a rip, a tear, and Jesus will pour out on the ground as surely as his blood soaked into the dusty Jerusalem dirt. Coming to know the Lord requires a certain kind of heart, one capable of a dynamic relationship with Jesus, one that breathes and lives and grows, not merely exists. It is filled with challenges on many levels. Yes, in regard to what we believe, but also what we feel. Since Jesus likens this to a marriage, a bridegroom with his bride, then we might ask, what would we expect in this regard? Two people whose hearts are open to one another, who share each other's world, establishing appropriate responses to one another based on open hearts and the recognition of who this person is. Flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone, the complementary person in my life. There is correspondence, interpersonal relationship. This was what Jesus' critics were missing. They were transacting business with their agendas. Jesus came to establish relationship. This is what this section is all about. What is appropriate if Jesus is with us, if the bridegroom is with us, if we in our relationship with him as disciples understand and realize his presence in our lives? What is the appropriate way to behave when he is there? I'm telling you, this is good discipling stuff. This is the kind of thing that transforms our lives, that makes a difference in our lives. Because yes, can I fast today? Yes, and I believe it's appropriate to fast today. But we don't fast because we don't have Jesus with us. We fast because of certain ministry challenges that we have because of certain circumstances that are in our lives, but we don't fast just because we're somehow grieving Jesus. No, he's with us. He is the husband of his bride, the church. And so I hope this section will encourage you to become a better and more fruitful disciple of Jesus Christ. So I hope you'll join us on Sunday, 10:30. Again, we'll be at Central for our second live service. We will record that service and then afterwards hopefully get it posted by 1 o'clock in the afternoon so that you, if you're not able to be with us, you can share in that. So God bless you. Take care. Talk to you next time.